For more than 2,000 years, one question about Jesus of Nazareth seemed permanently unanswerable. Not what he taught, not why he taught it, but where he came from. His lineage was recorded in two different Gospels that contradict each other. His biological father was never identified with certainty, and the man who became the centre of the largest religion in history could never have had his own genealogical records verified. Then, in 2024, DNA analyses of ancient populations from the Levant delivered an answer no one expected. But the answer wasn't what the headlines said, it was stranger. To understand what that DNA revealed, you have to go back to a small village in rural Galilee around the year 6 before the Common Era. A woman named Mary, young and from a humble family, became pregnant before marriage. She was engaged to a man named Joseph, a carpenter or builder, depending on the translation, from the tribe of Judah, of the lineage of David. No biological father was listed in the records in any way that modern science could verify. The Gospel of Matthew traces Jesus' genealogy through Joseph, 42 generations from Abraham, passing through David, Solomon, and arriving at Joseph. The Gospel of Luke makes the same journey, but in the opposite direction, from the present back to the past, and with an entirely different list of names. Both texts agree that Joseph was of the lineage of David. Both diverge on almost everything else. The question that no one could answer then, and that no one could definitively answer for the 2 millennia that followed, was this: who was Jesus genetically? Where did his ancestors come from? Was he what the Gospels proclaimed, a descendant of kings and patriarchs? Or was there something older, more complex, more surprising, hidden in his lineage? After the first serious studies of ancient population genomics began, a third possibility emerged. Researchers who analysed DNA from Levantine populations of the Second Temple period discovered something that shook premises established centuries earlier. For decades, historians and theologians had assumed that the population of Galilee at the time of Jesus was predominantly Jewish, descended from the tribes of Israel. That reasoning rested heavily on a simplified interpretation of the biblical text. But genetic archaeology told a different story. And so the mystery remained open but quiet. Most serious scholars settled for the biblical narrative as a frame of reference. Jesus himself, according to the Gospels, rarely spoke about his origin. When the Pharisees questioned his lineage to challenge him, he responded with questions, never with genealogies. When someone called him Son of David, he sometimes let it pass, sometimes challenged the very concept. He never, in any Gospel, produced a family tree. Then came the ancient DNA analyses. In 2016, an international consortium of geneticists published in the journal Nature the sequencing of DNA from 93 individuals, the ancient Levant, covering periods ranging from the Neolithic to the Bronze and Iron Ages. In 2020, an even more comprehensive study, coordinated by geneticist David Reich of Harvard University, sequenced populations from the ancient Middle East, covering exactly the period in which Jesus lived. In 2024, researchers from the Weizmann Institute of Science and the Hebrew University published the most complete study to date on the genetic pool of populations from 1st century Judea and Galilee. The results were unexpected. The population of Galilee in the Second Temple period was not genetically homogeneous. It carried overlapping layers of ancestry that reflected millennia of migration, conquest, and interbreeding. Galileans of Jewish origin predominantly carried DNA from Levantine populations of the Bronze Age, with genetically distinct contributions from populations of Anatolia, Egypt, and, to a lesser extent, Mesopotamia. But there was also, surprisingly, a significant presence of lineages tracing back to non-Semitic populations from much older eras. Galilee, unlike Judea to the south, had been called Galilee of the Gentiles by the Jews of Jerusalem themselves. That derogatory nickname reflected a genetic reality that modern studies were now confirming. The ancestors of Jesus, if he was from Nazareth in Galilee, as all four Gospels state, would have carried this mixture. There was nothing pure about that blood, not in the sense of race, not in the sense of ethnicity, not in the sense that any modern or ancient definition of genealogical purity would require. But the story was more complicated than any headline could contain. Professor Johannes Krauss, director of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, analysed the same data and pointed out a critical nuance. Judea and Galilee, despite their differences, shared a deeply common genetic substrate with Levantine populations tracing back to the Neolithic, between 8,000 and 6,000 years before the Common Era. That substrate was distinct from European, Sub-Saharan African and East Asian populations, but internally coherent. In other words, the populations that inhabited the land of Jesus were genetically a broad family, regardless of the ethnic and religious divisions they themselves drew. Geneticist Liran Carmel of the Hebrew University was more direct. The genetic boundaries between Jews, Samaritans, and other peoples of the ancient Levant were far more porous than the religious and cultural boundaries suggested. DNA did not respect the law of Moses. And there was another problem. The studies analysed populations, not individuals. No one had Jesus' DNA. Researchers were reconstituting the genetic pool of his era and region. But the lineage of a single individual within any population can vary dramatically from the average. The genealogy in Matthew lists 4 women, all extraordinary cases. Tamar, who disguised herself as a prostitute to bear children by her own father-in-law. Rahab, the prostitute of Jericho, who was Canaanite. Ruth, the Moabite, from a nation that Jews considered impure, and the wife of Uriah, whom David took in adultery. The evangelist himself seemed almost deliberately to be pointing to the impurity of the lineage. So what historians had in 2024 was a provocation dressed as a conclusion, an interesting signal from indirect sources amplified by headlines that confused population distribution with individual identity. It told us something about the deep ancestral origins of the populations of Jesus' region. It told us nothing definitive about the specific genealogy of a 1st century Galilean carpenter. The field needed more, and for 2,000 years that had seemed impossible. In the spring of 2023, a team of Israeli and Jordanian archaeologists announced the discovery of ossuaries in a cave near Jericho dating from the Second Temple period. These were limestone boxes used by 1st century Jews to store the bones of the dead after the flesh had decomposed. 23 ossuaries. DNA preserved in bone fragments and dental enamel. The period corresponded exactly to the life of Jesus. None of the individuals in the ossuaries were identified as Jesus of Nazareth. It would have been extremely unlikely that they were, but they represented exactly the population from which Jesus would have emerged, 1st century Galilean and Judean Jews in their most precisely preserved genetic states. The team, led by geneticist Eran El-Haik of the University of Sheffield, sequenced the DNA of 12 individuals and compared them against the largest available databases of ancient DNA. The results reshaped what was known. The individuals in the ossuaries carried a genetic mixture that was, in its largest part, from the ancient Levant, with smaller contributions from populations of Persia and Anatolia, reflecting the deportations and migrations of the centuries preceding the Babylonian captivity and the subsequent return. But one finding was particularly surprising. A significant proportion of their ancestry traced back to populations of northern Arabia and southern Mesopotamia, in a way that was consistent with the biblical accounts themselves of a patriarchal origin in Ur of the Chaldeans and in Haran. Abraham, according to the DNA of his presumed descendants, may have come from where the text said he came from. The headlines exploded. Biblical DNA confirms Abraham. Genetics validates the Old Testament. But the story was, as always, more complicated. El-Haik was careful. Genetic consistency was not proof of the literal biblical account. It was compatible with it. Many other explanations could produce the same genetic pattern. Commercial migrations, conquests, slavery, intermarriage across generations. DNA does not read sacred texts. It records movements of populations that sometimes coincided with the accounts of those texts and sometimes contradicted them. What remained, after the headlines and the controversy, was something quieter and more durable. The man who became the central symbol of the faith that would govern empires, persecute and be persecuted, that would divide the history of the world, literally, into before and after. That man emerged from a genetic pool that was nothing like what his later narratives would presume. He was not European, as Western painting portrayed him for 1,000 years. He was not of the tribal purity that both his defenders and his detractors projected onto him. He was Levantine, mixed, the product of millennia of migration and interbreeding that respected no ethnic or religious boundaries. Geneticist Vagish Narasimhan of the University of Chicago said it with surgical precision. Jesus would have been genetically indistinguishable from other Galilean Jews of his time, and that population was genetically a mixture of lineages that included contributions from Egypt, Arabia, Anatolia, and much older Neolithic populations. Nothing in that genetic profile resembles what centuries of European art made of his image. And there is an irony that remains in the air, heavy and quiet. The persecutions carried out in the name of Jesus across the centuries, the crusades that massacred entire populations of the Middle East, the Inquisition that expelled and murdered Jews across Europe, the centuries of anti-Semitism that culminated in gas chambers built in a nominally Christian Europe. All of it was done in the name of a man who was genetically Middle Eastern, descended from Semitic populations, a genetic cousin of the very Jews who would be persecuted. If Jesus could examine his own DNA results without knowing whose they were, and apply the racial purity criteria that his self-proclaimed medieval followers established, he would not have passed the test. He would have been the foreigner, the Semite, the non-European, the other. Turi King, the geneticist who identified the remains of Richard III, and who continues working on historical DNA projects, summarized the general paradox of such discoveries simply. Every time we apply real science to myths of purity, whether racial, ethnic, or religious, what we find underneath is not purity. It is mixture. It is movement. It is the real history of humanity, which never stood still anywhere, waiting for borders to be invented. Today, those ossuaries are under analysis in various laboratories. The research awaits further peer-reviewed publications, and somewhere in the parish records of first-century rural Galilee, the name of the man who biologically fathered Jesus of Nazareth is still missing. If the DNA of ancient populations tells us anything definitive, it may be this. The obsession with blood purity was always a lie. But whose lie was it really? Was it an ideology that followers believed? Or was it precisely what a restless humanity always invented? The fiction that somewhere, at some point in time, the blood was pure. If you want more stories where science turns history upside down, hit subscribe, because the next one is even more surprising than this one.